Hello everyone, good evening. Thank you very much for joining us here at the British Museum and online for tonight's lecture by Paul Collins on Assyrian Crown Princes. My name is Ian Andrews and I'm a member of the Advisory Council here. Before introducing Paul and getting down to the real business of finding out whether Assyrian monarchs were House of Stark, House of Targaryen or House of Lannister. I know what my money's on, but I'll see what you think. I do need to go through some admin. First of all, in the hopefully extremely unlikely event that we need to evacuate the building, there are green signs at the back. Escape hatches at the back, so you go there, or at the two at the sides here. I'm sure you're going to all leave in a very orderly manner if that's required, but if any of you would need help in such a situation, there will be members of staff to assist. For people online, there is a chat facility, so if you have any technical problems, one of the technical team will be able to help you with that. And also throughout Paul's lecture, you can pose questions through the Q&A facility on the button on Zoom which says Q&A. And then at the end we will take some questions after the lecture and we'll try and make sure both from here in person and from online. So, Paul Collins, it's an honour to have him here. He has a very, very long history of dealing with Mesopotamia. He's currently Keeper of the Middle East here at the British Museum, but he's also been the lead curator at the Zayed National Museum in Abu Dhabi, as well as the Keeper of Antiquities at the Ashmolean. I don't know about you, I've always particularly loved the winged lions, which you can see just over there, and I'm really fascinated to hear more from Paul about the history behind them.
Ian, thank you very much indeed. It's a great honour to be here this evening. Wonderful to see so many people in the audience, and I hope as many people, if not more, at home. And I thought I would just talk about a Game of Thrones, focusing in on what is the most important individual for a monarchy that stresses the importance of succession from father to son. You can't do that without the crown prince. But let's situate the story first in the region of ancient Mesopotamia. We're looking at the kingdom of Assyria, which is located in the north of Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. If we zoom in, we can find Assyria here, focused on the river Tigris. Its ancient capital city was Ashur, right there in the middle of the screen. And it was from Ashur that the Assyrian kings started to launch military campaigns out across the wider Middle East, starting from around 900 BC. So here's our Assyrian king with his army, and starting, as I say, around 900 BC, we find the Assyrian armies marching towards the Mediterranean and conquering that part of the Middle East. Over the next 300 years, the Assyrian armies marched south into Babylonia, southern Mesopotamia, modern southern Iraq. And then eventually, as we will see as part of the story I'll tell this evening, the Assyrian armies marched as far as Egypt, which they conquered. So between 900 and 600 BC, the Assyrians came to dominate the Middle East and created really, I think, arguably the world's first empire. From around 870 BC, a new capital was established for the Assyrian kingdom, moving north from the old capital of Ashur to the site of Nimrud. And there, a massive building project was undertaken to create a vast citadel mound and a new royal city. So from around 879 BC, we see here in this digital reconstruction of the citadel mound at Nimrud a vast complex for the royal family. And in that complex, huge palaces were constructed from mud brick, but lined for the first time with huge slabs of carved gypsum. Here you can see a reconstruction of the interior of a royal palace made by the excavator of some of the earliest Assyrian reliefs to be discovered in Assyria in the mid-19th century, Henry Layard. And he recognized in this reconstruction and from the evidence he was finding that these great carved slabs of stone not only lined the walls of these great royal palace rooms and courtyards, but were originally brightly coloured. And so these were spectacular, magnificent settings for the royal court, for the king, for his queen, and of course, for his crown prince. And in those reliefs from Nimrud, so dating from around 870 BC, we find a recurring theme focused on the Assyrian king himself. No great surprise there. And here are two details of two reliefs, which you can see upstairs, of course, in galleries 7 on the ground floor of the museum. Here, details focusing in showing the king, who is always easily identifiable. He's standing there on the left of each of the slabs, identified by his tall conical headdress with a little knob on the top. And because he's the focus of attention, the king in this particular case holds the bow of the warrior, which he's holding with the string facing away from him, which represents victory in this moment as depicted on the relief. But associated with the king, and a recurring theme across many of these reliefs, is another figure who is very easily identifiable by his particular outfit, and that's the crown prince. And he's shown with a diadem, and it's a very specific type of diadem which has two bands with tassels hanging down the back. Now, the diadem was presented to the crown prince when he was appointed to that role. And any of the king's son, regardless of their age, could be chosen by their father to become crown prince. Not necessarily the oldest, simply the favoured son. The headband would be given to the crown prince, who would then be set up in the so-called House of Succession, a part of the palace with its own royal court and staff. So the crown prince then became the second most important individual in the Assyrian state, answerable directly to the king himself, much more important than the chief cupbearer, the commander-in-chief, the treasurer, the whole gamut of elite personnel of the court. The crown prince was second to the king. And he would report directly to the king from Assyria itself, but also from the provinces, where he would be sent to learn the craft of kingship and, of course, come to know the territories over which he would eventually rule. Now, the image you see on the right of the screen shows our Assyrian king, in this case, the Assyrian king Ashurnasirpal II, standing before his crown prince who faces him. Again, very easily identifiable from his diadem with tasseled streamer at the back. And between the king and the crown prince, hovering above them, is a god in a winged disc. And that god probably represents the supreme god of Assyria, Ashur, perhaps fused with the god of justice, the sun god Shamash. And if you look at the image of the god emerging out of that winged disk, he holds in his hand a ring. And this is the divine ring of power, authority, kingship. And in this image, it's almost as if the god is handing that ring to the crown prince. That moment when the king passes authority to his heir. And of course, in the royal inscriptions, we are given the impression that the transfer of power always happens smoothly, seamlessly. The king dies and the crown prince takes over. But of course, that almost certainly obscures the reality of the occasion. Because when a king dies and a new one is appointed, it offers an opportunity for rebellion. It's a moment of danger when there could be rivals to the throne who take advantage of that moment, or there are rebellions out in the empire as people seek their independence. And it's those moments of rebellion and opposition that I want to touch on in the talk today. And to do that, I want to move into the 8th century BC, so some 120, 130 years after Ashurnasirpal, and consider the story of the succession of Assyrian kings and their heirs. And we know a great deal about that because we're able to reconstruct the Assyrian royal family in immense detail from around 745 BC down to the end of the Assyrian Empire. The royal inscriptions, but backed up by administrative texts and letters and other documents, allow us insights into the names of queens and the offspring of their union. So let's begin our story for today, up there right at the top, in the mid-8th century BC. A king, you might just be able to make out the name of Tiglath-Pileser III. How did he come to the throne? Well, let's return to the map of Assyria. And in the mid-8th century BC, Assyria was facing a major crisis. There had been rebellions within the kingdom itself. Plague had ravaged the country, and the king seemed to be ineffectual in dealing with these issues. The biggest problem facing Assyria at this time was the kingdom of Urartu to the north of Assyria, which was expanding its control westwards and south into what was thought to be Assyrian territory. And that threat from Urartu led around 746 BC to a major rebellion at Nimrud, a rebellion that toppled the king, a king called Ashur-nirari V, and a new man came to the throne who took the throne name Tiglath-Pileser. He was the third king of that name to rule Assyria. Now, Tiglath-Pileser was almost certainly a member of the royal family, but we can be absolutely confident he was not the crown prince. So he had claimed the throne in a rebellion against the legitimate king and the legitimate crown prince. And it's significant that he's chosen as his throne name a name which evoked a powerful warrior king of the 12th, 11th century BC. So he's looking back in time and adopting that name to evoke, in a sense, a new beginning. But remember, he's a usurper. He's not the legitimate crown prince. So taking the name Tiglath-Pileser perhaps was a useful way in which he could deal with this issue of his lack of legitimacy. Tiglath-Pileser is the way in which we think of the name today, largely driven by the reference in the Hebrew Bible to this king. But in Assyrian, his name is actually Tukulti Apel Eshara. And that name means, my trust belongs to the son of the Eshara temple. Now, how do we break that down? Well, the Eshara temple is home to the supreme god Ashur. So the Eshara is the great temple of the god Ashur in the original capital of, also called Ashur. And the son of the Eshara temple is the crown prince of Ashur, who is a god called Ninurta. So by adopting the name Tiglath-Pileser, Tukulti Apel Eshara, our new king links himself to the crown prince of the supreme god of Assyria. And by doing so, neatly sidesteps the need to reference his own father in his royal inscriptions, which would be the traditional way in which you showed you were a legitimate king. We get no reference to this man's father in his inscriptions. So he evokes the crown prince of the divine world, the god Ninurta. Now, Tiglath-Pileser transformed Assyria's fortunes by confronting Urartu directly and expanding Assyrian control in all directions across the Middle East, establishing the first provinces of a new empire. So this is really the beginning of the Assyrian Empire. And in the wall reliefs from the palace that he constructed for himself at Nimrud, he presents himself at the center of all activity. And we find scenes of battle and cities under siege, as well as the aftermath, with captives and animals under escort. And you can see lines of prisoners in the top register of this great fragment of relief from Nimrud dating to his reign. Again, visible for anybody to take a closer look upstairs. So tribute and booty to the kings was a favorite theme for the Assyrian sculptors. And a very prominent role is given to the crown prince in these scenes. Now, we don't have very many reliefs from the reign of Tiglath-Pileser, simply because his palace was dismantled later in the Assyrian Empire and the reliefs reused in other palaces. So only fragments survive. So we have some drawings from excavations made in the 19th century of some reliefs and some very fragmentary scenes surviving, which again are now part of the British Museum's collections. But there the crown prince plays a prominent role. And that seems to be deliberate. Perhaps Tiglath-Pileser is making the clear point that despite his own rather dubious route to the throne, he placed great store on convention. At some point, he promoted a son called Ululaya to the position of heir apparent. And when Tiglath-Pileser died in 727 BC, apparently of natural causes, the crown prince Ululaya took the throne and adopted the throne name of Shalmaneser, Shalmaneser V, apparently without any challenge. So now Shalmaneser V dominates the Middle East. Ululaya is crowned king, and he launches campaigns to consolidate his control over the expanding Assyrian Empire. And most famously of all, he launches a siege of the capital of the kingdom of Israel, Samaria. So there's the Assyrian forces engaged with this rebellious city against the opposition of the kingdom of Israel. Yet, what appears to be a strong and stable kingship, we see history repeating itself, because within 5 years of his reign, Shalmaneser was overthrown by his brother in what may have been another palace coup. The usurper took the name Sargon, became the second Assyrian monarch to connect themselves with the great King Sargon, a great warrior king of the 3rd millennium BC. But it might be significant that the name Sargon means the king is legitimate, which perhaps suggests a level of special pleading. Certainly, Sargon needed to start afresh. He faces rebellion from within Assyria itself to the fact he's usurped the throne, as well as from the provinces. And it takes several years to crush resistance. And to do that, he initiates effectively a new phase of kingship. He wants a new start. And so just like with the establishment of Nimrud 170 years before, he now establishes a new royal center from which new beginnings can be launched. And so he creates a new center to the north of Nimrud called Dur Sharokane, the fortress of Sargon. We know it today by its modern name of Khorsabad. And there a magnificent setting is created from scratch, and he relied on buildings and imagery which he drew from both Nimrud, the traditions he saw on the stone reliefs there, but with new innovations. Khorsabad was excavated in the 19th century, initially by the French. And so if you go to the Louvre Museum, it is the collection in the Assyrian galleries there are largely from this site. And they are, of course, magnificent in their quality and scale. And in that imagery, a recurring theme, rather like with Tiglath-Pileser before him, is on the immediate members of his family. We know that Sargon, in order to secure security within his new palace buildings, he elevated his brother to the important role of Grand Vizier, and his son, Sennacherib, was made Crown Prince. And so here in one of the few reliefs from Khorsabad in the British Museum, you see there on the left-hand side of the slide, you see an image of Sargon II before his crown prince, here almost certainly the crown prince Sennacherib. And Sennacherib, or at least the image of the crown prince, appears repeatedly on the palace walls at Dur Sharokane. He's shown introducing long lines of officials and tribute bearers into the presence of the king. And again, it's probably there to stress continuity of the royal family after such a turbulent period. We know much more about the role of the crown prince at this time, since a number of letters sent from Sennacherib to his father survive. So written in clay, in the cuneiform script, letters the size to fit in an individual hand, tablets, were written on behalf of the crown prince by his senior scribes and delivered to Sargon, who was often away from the capital on campaign or visiting conquered territories. They include questions for the king to answer, as well as reports on local and regional matters, and all begin with a very specific greeting, used only by the crown prince. So, for example, here's a letter, and it always begins, so you always know this is from the crown prince because they always begin in this form. To the king, my lord, your servant Sennacherib. Good health to the king, my lord. Assyria is well, the temples are well, all the king's forts are well. The king, my lord, can be glad indeed. And then, I'll give you an example of the sort of information that Sennacherib then relayed to his father. The emissaries of a region in what is now southeast Turkey, have come, he says, bringing tribute, and with it 7 teams of mules. The tribute and the mules are entrusted to the embassy, and the emissaries too are there eating their bread. Now, should they, the tribute and the mules, be picked up and brought to Babylon, where the king was, or can they be received here at Khorsabad? Let them immediately write me what the king my lord commands. So really detailed information embedded in these letters, which are moving back and forward across the empire. Now, Sargon's ambition that Assyrian kingship would be maintained into the future through his heir apparent from Dur-Sharrukin, from Khorsabad, ended with his death in battle in 705 BC. This was a really inauspicious event, made especially so by the fact that the king's body was not recovered and therefore couldn't be given an appropriate burial. This had the potential, of course, to unleash a period of turmoil, but Sennacherib had consolidated his position as crown prince sufficiently so that there was no challenge, it seems, to his accession. At least that's as far as we are able to understand the text. He acted quickly, however, to move the royal centre of power, however, away from his royal father's city of Khorsabad, and established his centre at the very ancient and very venerable centre of Nineveh. So again, abandoning Khorsabad and the inauspicious death of his father, and moving to a new site to once again start from scratch. And here at Nineveh, Sennacherib established the greatest of the Assyrian royal centres. Over 10 years, Sennacherib transformed the city into a magnificent metropolis. Here you're looking at a Google Earth image of the modern city of Mosul in northern Iraq. An Islamic city established in the 7th century AD, on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side of the river Tigris. You can see where the dot on Google Earth places the original centre of the Islamic city. And that was established opposite the remains of ancient Nineveh. And to give you a sense of the extent of the city created by Sennacherib, there are the outlines of walls, to some extent still standing, albeit badly damaged by attacks by Daesh, ISIS, some 10 years ago. The heart of Nineveh, however, was the great citadel mound, an ancient settlement mound in the heart of the city, known today as Kuyunjik. And here again, drawing on these elaborate reconstructions by learning sites, virtual reconstructions, you're looking here at the so-called Nergal Gate, one of the gateways into the downtown Nineveh, and in the distance there, the great citadel mound of Kuyunjik, surrounded by massive walls encompassing the great palace complexes at the heart of the city. One of the great winged bulls that guarded the Nergal Gate, standing there on the right of the slide, sadly now obliterated in the destructions by ISIS. But here, a reconstruction of the citadel mound to give you a sense of what Sennacherib was building, and it was his so-called southwest palace, in the southwest quarter of the citadel mound, that he constructed what he called a palace without rival. And just like at Nimrud and at Khorsabad before, he lined the walls of rooms and courtyards with great slabs of carved gypsum depicting his scenes of triumph in battle, processions of tribute to the king, and his building works of Nineveh itself. Now, by the time the palace was completed, around 693 BC, Sennacherib may have already appointed his son, Urdu-mulissu, to that role as crown prince. And here you can see a very famous image of Sennacherib, him looking over the defeat of the Judean city of Lachish. Again, you can see the narrative laid out on the walls of room 10 in the galleries upstairs. Sennacherib, his face literally defaced, damaged, and we'll come back to that later in the story. But you've got before him his crown prince, almost certainly Urdu-mulissu, presenting to the king the new representatives that will rule over Lachish on behalf of the conqueror king, who holds again in his hand, just like we saw with Ashurnasirpal in the 9th century, the bow of the conqueror, with the string of the bow facing away from him, indicating victory and might. So the king pointing and looking to his heir as his successor, establishing that in place. Now, the immediate future of Assyrian kingship therefore seemed settled. But behind the scenes, we begin to read in some of the administrative texts, there were intrigues at court, perhaps even rival factions jostling for privilege and influence. In the words of a later Assyrian document, the royal princes, and I quote, butted heads for power. So here we start to see a Game of Thrones. By the later 680s BC, this plotting may have even reached the ears of the king. A cuneiform letter sent from Babylonia, which may date to this very period, appears to suggest that Urdu-mulissu was contemplating patricide. According to the contents of the letter, a temple worker overheard of talk of a planned rebellion against Sennacherib, and he approached 2 Assyrian officials who asked him, "What is your appeal to the king about?" And the temple official replied, "It is about Prince Urdu-mulissu." And then, in an account straight from a Cloak and Dagger thriller, we are told that the man is blindfolded and brought into the presence of a man he assumes will be the king. However, the letter goes on, they covered his face with a cloak and made him stand before Urdu-mulissu, saying, "Behold, your appeal is granted. Say it with your own voice." And he said, in all innocence, "Your son Urdu-mulissu is going to murder you." Unsurprisingly, it didn't end well for the informant. It goes on to say, they uncovered his face, and after Urdu-mulissu had interrogated him, they killed him and his brothers. So the court may have become a very dangerous place, a place of conspiracy, accusation, and misdirection. And as a result, Sennacherib's youngest son, Esarhaddon, later in his inscriptions claimed to have removed himself at this time to a province somewhere in the west. Now things came to a head in 681 BC, when, as recorded in the so-called Babylonian Chronicle, on the 20th day of the month of Tebet, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, was killed by his son in a rebellion. Civil war engulfed Assyria for over 40 days as rival forces gathered around Esarhaddon, the youngest son, and Urdu-Mulissu, and their armies clashed in eastern Syria. By 680 BC, Esarhaddon had emerged with sufficient support from within Assyria itself so that he was able to enter Nineveh and claim the throne. Although the regicide is not named in the chronicle, it might, of course, have been Urdu-Mulissu, especially if his position as crown prince was under threat. There's the thought, perhaps, that Sennacherib had changed his mind and was looking to appoint Esarhaddon in his stead. That's certainly the narrative as understood by the later compilers of the Hebrew Bible, who record one day while Sennacherib, was worshipping in the temple of his god Nisroch, his sons Adramelech, Urdu-Mulissu, and Sherazar killed him with the sword, and they escaped to the land of Ararat, Urartu, and Esarhaddon, his son, succeeded him as king. Now it's possible, equally, that the murder had been engineered by Esarhaddon, who, having secured the throne, disseminated through official and unofficial channels an account that accused his brothers. Perhaps that's the moment that earlier letter was created. There followed a mass execution of Esarhaddon's opponents. And Esarhaddon went on to campaign across the Middle East. So having claimed the throne, now he set out to establish control right the way across the region, pushing from Iran to eastern Anatolia, into Arabia, conquering the city of Sidon over there on the Mediterranean coast. And after a failed attempt, his greatest triumph was the invasion of Egypt in 671 BC, driving the pharaoh Taharka out of the capital, Memphis. Now, this success came a year after Esarhaddon put into effect a plan for his succession, and that took place at Nimrud, which Esarhaddon seems to be in the process of reviving as his royal centre. He sought to find a way to deal with the problem of succession and the inevitable rivalry for the throne from within the royal family. And as a way of managing this, his novel solution was to divide Mesopotamia between two of his sons. Ashurbanipal would become king of Assyria, and his other son, Shamash-shum-ukin, king of Babylon. Now, to emphasize the significance of this arrangement, the appointment of Ashurbanipal as crown prince of Assyria was stage-managed at Nimrud in the most elaborate manner. It evolved a public ceremony on an almost unimaginable scale, in which representatives of the different peoples of the empire came to Nimrud to swear an oath of allegiance to the young man. And on the 12th of Ere, the months of March, April, 672 BC, proceedings commenced at Nimrud. And given the number of people involved, the event was repeated over several days. The oath was a legal treaty binding both Assyrians and their vassals to acknowledge and support Ashurbanipal as the future Assyrian king. It was presumably recited out loud, but the contents were also written down on large cuneiform tablets, so that each contingent attending the ceremony could take home one of them as a record of their agreement. Around 10 copies of this so-called succession treaty have survived, and you see there on the left of the screen one of those succession treaties that is held here in the British Museum, finely written in cuneiform. The first section of the oath makes its intentions very clear. You have it there. This is the treaty which Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, has concluded with you in the presence of the great gods of heaven and earth, on behalf of Ashurbanipal, the great crown prince designate, son of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, your lord, whom he has named and appointed as crown prince. And it goes on. When Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, passes away, you will seat Ashurbanipal, the great crown prince designate, upon the royal throne, and he will exercise the kingship and lordship of Assyria over you. You shall protect him in country and in town, fall and die for him. You shall speak with him in truth in your heart, give him sound advice loyally, and smooth the way in every respect. You shall not depose him or seat any one of his brothers, elder or younger, on the throne of Assyria instead of him. You shall neither change nor alter the word of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, but serve this very Ashurbanipal, the great crown prince designate, whom Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, your lord, has presented to you, and he shall exercise the kingship and dominion over you. It is the longest treaty known from Assyria, and what I've read is just one small fragment of it. A complete translation runs to many, many pages. The text makes it clear that the terms applied not just to those who swore them, but to future generations. And if anybody thought to break their word after the text or destroy their copy of the tablet, they would fall victim to 68 curses listed at the end of the document. I'll give you a flavour of what they had in store if the tablets were destroyed. I won't read all 68, just a flavour. May Ashur decree an evil and unpleasant fate for you. May the god Anu let disease, exhaustion, malaria, sleeplessness, worries, and ill health reign upon all your houses. May the god Sin clothe you with leprosy. May the god Shamash remove your eyesight. May the god Ninurta fill the plain with your blood and feed your flesh to the eagle and vulture. May the goddess Ishtar make your wives lie in the lap of your enemy before your eyes. May all the great gods of heaven and earth who inhabit the universe and are mentioned by name in this tablet strike you, look at you in anger, uproot you from among the living, and curse you grimly with a painful curse. And then, to provide the document with divine protection, every tablet was impressed, before the text was written, with 3 very special cylinder seals. You can see, I hope, some of them impressed in the detail at the top of the tablet here. All 3 seals belonged to the god Ashur, as is evident from a caption written at the top of the tablets, which reads, "Seal of the god Ashur, king of the gods, lord of the lands, not to be altered. Seal of the great ruler, father of the gods, not to be disputed." And remarkably, each seal dates to a key period of Assyrian power. dating to the 19th, the 13th, and the 7th centuries BC. The latest seal from the time of Sennacherib is identified by an inscription as Ashur's seal of destinies, thereby associating the treaty with the mythological tablet of destinies on which the gods wrote the fate of the cosmos. And then, if the message wasn't hammered home sufficiently by the oath-taking ceremony, Esarhaddon commissioned a number of monuments that served to underline the new arrangement. 3 monumental stelae survive. One from the site of Samal, which you see here, from modern Zincirli in Turkey, and 2 others from Tilbasit in modern-day Syria. And all 3, and there were probably many more, depict Esarhaddon raising a cone, perhaps containing perfumed oil, to his nose in a religious gesture. And he points towards images and symbols of the supreme Assyrian gods. At his feet are miniature figures of the king of Tyre and Taharka's son, who had been captured at Memphis. Esarhaddon holds in his left hand a mace of authority and the coil ends of leashes that are attached by rings to the 2 men's lips. The Assyrian king, however, is not alone in his triumph, as carved on the sides of the stela are the figures of Ashurbanipal, who you see here facing Esarhaddon and wearing the diadem of the crown prince. And at the rear, on the other side of the monument, and unfortunately I don't have an image to show you, is Shamash Shuma Ukin, smaller in scale, who would be appointed as king of Babylon. So this effort to ensure a smooth succession seems to have, inevitably perhaps, we now recognize a recurring pattern, played out against a backdrop of growing discontent among some senior officials, including a few who may have been distant members of the royal family. And a number of letters point to conspiracies and attempted rebellions in both Nineveh and Ashur. Esarhaddon gathered intelligence about these threats, and then in 670 BC, there was another mass execution of officials. The following year, 669 BC, the Assyrian king died en route to crush a rebellion of Taharka in Egypt, and Ashurbanipal ascended the throne, apparently without opposition. And so Ashurbanipal, who would turn out to be the last great king of Assyria, now ruled an empire stretching from Egypt to Iran. But what is very interesting about the reliefs created by Ashurbanipal in his building works at Nineveh is the absence of a crown prince. We know from inscriptions, from the letters, from the texts, that he had offspring, that he had sons, but he chooses not to depict them in his images. So here, for example, you see Ashurbanipal receiving the royal regalia from his conquests of Babylon. But there is no Assyrian crown prince, as we're introducing the defeated enemies or the tribute to the king. And Ashurbanipal's great buildings in Nineveh was a new center of authority outside of his grandfather's southwest palace, the so-called North Palace. And the imagery lining the walls of this palace include, of course, some of the most famous reliefs to have survived from ancient Assyria. Whereas the rooms and courtyards were lined with images showing the king's great victories in battle, the corridors connecting all those rooms were lined with images of the king hunting lions. And so along those corridors, linking the scenes of great victories in war, were scenes of the king hunting the most dangerous animals of Assyria. And Ashurbanipal presents himself as the Assyrian king doing that, wearing the tall royal crown of Assyria. Much taller, with a much larger knob at the top than in earlier kings, but clearly defining himself as the Assyrian monarch. And of course, we're all familiar with the slaughter of the lions, expressing his power over the dangerous forces of nature, of chaos. The king uses bow or spear or sword, but always as the Assyrian king with his tall conical crown. And we have a sense of this hunting of lions as a ritual act which was dedicated to the great goddess of Assyria, Ishtar, the warrior goddess, the goddess of sexuality and aggression, powerful goddess that Ashurbanipal had great affection for, and depicts her in his inscriptions as both his mother and his nanny. He looked to her as the goddess that, in fact, on which suckled him and raised him. And here, in this image, the aftermath of the hunting, we see Ashurbanipal with his tall crown and an inscription which reads, "I, Ashurbanipal, king of the universe, king of the land of Ashur, whom Ashur and Ashur's wife Ninlil endowed with supreme strength, the lions which I killed, I aimed the terrible bow of Ishtar, lady of battle, at them. I offered an offering over them. I poured a libation of wine over them." So the hunting field was dedicated to Ishtar. But in other images from the North Palace, we find depictions of the scene of the slaughter of lions and other animals where the king is shown in a different way. Here we have an image of the king dispatching a lion with a spear, and we know this is Ashurbanipal because we have descriptions in cuneiform texts which describe these very scenes. By the time they are carved, Ashurbanipal has been king of Assyria for 20 years. So why is he being depicted, as you can all now recognize, as the Assyrian crown prince, wearing the diadem with tassels down the back? Here he is with bow and arrow. Again, the texts make it clear this is Ashurbanipal, and there's no sense that he's anyone but the monarch. And the most famous image, perhaps, is this of our king confronting a lion directly, which mirrors exactly the imperial seal of Assyria, which was used to impress on cuneiform tablets, a signet ring carved with the same design which represented the authority of the king. Well, there's one way perhaps of suggesting what's going on here if we look closely at Ashurbanipal's belt. Because there, rather than the daggers as found in the belt of earlier Assyrian kings, we find not a dagger, but the writing tools of a scribe. What you're looking at are not chopsticks, but the stylus of a scribe to make cuneiform in clay tablets. And given that this is the crown, he's depicted as the crown prince, but he's depicted as the scribe, and we know Ashurbanipal wanted to be seen as a scholar from his inscriptions. He created a vast library, and his inscriptions reference him understanding texts, as he says, from before the flood, from distant days, something he was really keen to emphasize. So here, I suggest, you've got Ashurbanipal presenting himself as the divine crown prince, Nabu, or a god closely associated with Nabu as a god of scribes, the warrior god Ninurta. Again, we come back to that reference we saw with Tiglath-Pileser. And at the North Palace, we have images of more idyllic scenes of the conquests of lions, but lions roaming in elaborate gardens, more peaceful scenes. And these scenes lead down to the heart of the North Palace, where perhaps the most famous image of Ashurbanipal and his queen was discovered. Here is the king with his queen, Labali Sharat, in this luxurious garden, celebrating his victories, in this case over the Elamites of Iran. And that scene mirrors very closely a 7th century BC hymn from Nineveh known as the love lyrics of Nabu and Tashmetu. So Nabu, the god of scribes, the god of writing, and his wife, Tashmetu. And it reads, here's just a fraction of that love poem. For what are you adorned, my Tashmetu, so that I may go to the garden with you, my Nabu? May my eyes see the plucking of your fruit. May my ears hear the twittering of your birds. Bind your nights to the beautiful garden. Let my Tashmetu come with me to the garden. May her eyes behold the plucking of my fruit. So that this scene seems to evoke these images of Nabu and his wife Tashmetu. So we can think of Queen Labali Sharat as in some way evoking in these scenes the goddess Ishtar, but also Tashmetu, and Ashurbanipal standing in for Ashur, Nabu, or Ninurta. And Ninurta, I think, is a really important reference here because he's the archetypal Mesopotamian prince. He's described in the text as young, vigorous, and strong, a paragon of hunting and learning, everything Ashurbanipal claimed, or at least wanted to be. Now, the great triumphs of Ashurbanipal would come to an end 30 years after his death, when Assyria was attacked by forces from Babylonia to the south, and the Medes of Iran joining with the Babylonians from the east. And they sacked the royal centers of Assyria between 614 and 612 BC. By 612, Nineveh itself had fallen to the forces of the Babylonians and Medes, and they looted the royal palace and set it alight. But before the palace was destroyed in the flames, it was somebody's job to walk through those palace rooms and deface the king, because although he had died in reality, these images retained the power of Assyrian kingship, and you had to destroy it. So deliberately targeted, not random vandalism, but targeted erasure of the power of the Assyrian king. And here, Ashurbanipal, you can see on the left of the slide, his arms have been severed and the end of his sword cut, releasing the lion to freedom. Whereas on this image on the right, it is the tail of the lion that has been hammered at to free him from the grasp of the Assyrian king, destroying the might of the Assyrian Empire in reality as well as symbolically, evoking the power of the gods once again. And Assyria is left to vanish into the past. Thank you very much.
Well, Thank you very much, Paul. That was really interesting, and certainly when I go back up to those rooms, it's been brought alive to me, so thank you very much for that. We do have some time for some questions. People online, if you haven't already, you can put some questions by going on the Q&A button on Zoom, or we can have some questions from here if people want. If you want to ask a question, if you wait, the gentleman there in the white, wait for the mic to come so you can hear the question. Thank you.
The habit of relocating and building another citadel, more and more wonderful every time, must have used masses of resources. What would have happened, or what could have happened, had that not been the habit?
So I think I heard that you.
Well, if rather than the resources being used to establish a new palace,
Yes.
it had been used for other purposes that would possibly let the builder of that palace survive longer or do better.
Sure. So one of the ways in which the empire was held together was through a really very sophisticated administrative system, where the provincial governors were responsible for ensuring taxes flowed to the centre of Assyria. And where there were gaps in production, whether that was in terms of agriculture or building works, then people will be moved across the Middle East to fill those gaps. And probably as much as 1 million people over time would have been relocated as part of that process. So an enormous undertaking. And these great building works, of course, were the way in which you used large numbers of people in this way. So certainly it was a very deliberate way of moving certainly rebellious people around, but also other people, to create a uniform, standardized empire. And building royal cities was part of that process. Clearly, if they hadn't decided to build new cities but had stayed put in one centre, then those people could have been used for other purposes. But the Assyrian Empire was based entirely on this process of complex administrative management of resource.
We actually have one question from online, which is, Veronica asks, what age was the Crown Prince typically appointed, and could the king change his mind?
So we're not, there's no good evidence always for determining when a son is chosen, what age the son is chosen. But we do see a sense of the king changing his mind, and that may well have been what happened with Urda-Mulisu and Esarhaddon. So Urda-Mulisu is appointed from around 693 BC, and then presumably thinks he's now going to become king, and then by the late 680 BC, it's quite possible that Sennacherib has changed his mind, and some might say the persuasion of Esarhaddon's mother, a woman called Nakia, who is clearly an important presence at court, persuades the older Sennacherib to change his mind and get her son elevated to the position. And that's when rebellion breaks out. Much debate among scholars whether that's the right reconstruction, but nonetheless it is certainly possible for the king to change his mind and pick somebody else. But you're asking for trouble, almost certainly, if you do.
So we've got time, I think, for one more question for the audience.
Thank you very much. It was a very fascinating lecture. I'm just wondering, and I think you've already alluded to this through the beautiful imagery of the Queen and also this reference to the mother, but what sort of powers and tools of persuasion and influence did women have at court, and how influential were they in sort of manoeuvring, whether it was through marriage or sort of elements of having their son being presented? It would be really interesting to have that element explored as well.
Yeah, I think I focused on the Crown Prince, but you could do an equally fascinating talk on the queens of Assyria. They were really important individuals. They don't appear until very late in the sequence of Assyrian reliefs. So we see them depicted in the 7th century BC. But the fact that they weren't depicted earlier doesn't mean that they were in some way secluded or unimportant. It just means that the images were about kingship as opposed to the role of Assyrian queens. And we know from the text that the queen had her own court, her own throne room, her own part of the royal palace, that she was presented with tribute and wealth, owned land, just like the king, and could manage estates in parallel with that of the king. And if one thinks of the royal family as sort of mirroring the divine family, then if the king, in some sense, stands for the supreme god Ashur, then the queen stands for his wife, Mulissu Ishtar, and then the crown prince for their divine offspring. So the queen, absolutely a fundamental player in the politics, and we know that there are times when very effective queens, who might not necessarily actually be the king's wife, but that's another story. The queen could accompany a king into battle, or actually, no doubt, persuade king particular direction. So absolutely, they were a central part of the story of the royal court.
Thank you very much.
So thank you again, Paul. Paul has actually written a book. He's written many books, but he's written a very recent book called The Assyrians' Lost Civilization, which I'd really like you to be able to buy. Unfortunately, because of printing problems, we can't, because it's not printed yet. We haven't got it here. However, all of you should have received an email online with a code allowing you to buy it when it is available, and there is a discount, actually, if you use a code Assyrians24. So Assyrians24, you'll get 20% discount. So you remember 2024, that's how you remember it. So I can encourage you to do that. However, thank you for all of you for joining, and for everyone online for joining. For those of us here, Paul's kindly going to stay around. You can have a drink for your little token, if you've kept your little token, and Paul will happily come and talk to you afterwards. Thank you again.